Hello, Cristóbal Co, Senior Education Technology Specialist at the World Bank. I'm now interested in share with you key remarks on some country experiences that I think it can be fruitful for learning from others to see what has been implemented and deployed to support remote and blended learning experiences. And before starting, I think it's fair to say that there's not a country that has been implemented in the right way. I think different countries, according to their context, are being explored different approaches. So rather than emphasizing the good and the wrong, I would say the diversity is very helpful for decision makers to decide what of these approaches can be relevant for others to take into account. And before starting, I would like to borrow some ideas from the World Economic Forum Blended Learning Framework, which highlights the difference between the policy and the management at different levels, and at the same time, the combination of the teaching and learning practice, the quality of the learning resources, the sort of assessment implemented, the teacher's capacity, as well as to what extent the infrastructure is inclusive enough. And I think these kind of dimensions will be very helpful to analyze different countries, but at the same time to understand where the focus has been allocated depending on different regions and policy priorities. So what are some of the different education systems that have been implementing and how they've been doing that task? I think is an undergoing scenario, but it really shed a lot of lights on where the countries are being focused. So let me start with some low and middle income countries. And I think has been interesting to observe that some of the remote and blended learning strategies, although highlight some opportunities, at the same time, they emphasize the need of understanding that any decision could have a side effect. So for instance, in the state of Edo within Nigeria, whether they rely heavily on the use of digital devices, at the same time, they encounter the challenge that not all the households have access to the infrastructure. In the case of Kenya, with a long tradition supporting remote and distance education, they implement a multi-modal solution. However, the students were not necessarily required to use these materials, so they couldn't make the best of these materials. In the case of Peru, in Latin America, they ensured that the teachers and the students' interaction was appropriate monitored, but at the same time, the delay in the reopening of a pandemic that went far beyond that what everybody expected really affect the possibility of keeping that engagement at the highest possible level. So these are some of the pros and cons and challenges that we observe. Let me share the other example from Nepal with a fairly high penetration of mobile, but at the same time, where their access to smartphones is not necessarily equally high. Where interestingly, 3/4 of the population do not use radio. And at the same time, the access to television varies significantly, equally to the access of low access to computers and limited access to infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure. So all these really offer different contexts where you will have to design how does it look, your technological reality in terms of infrastructure, to what extent you are enabling the conditions for updating and revising the contents into a remote or blended learning experience, because we all know that the in-person or face-to-face learning experience should not be automatically translated to other remote learning experiences or blended experiences, and the adjustment in terms of the use of the time, the use of the attention, the kind of interaction that can be offered are going to be critical, right? Now, when we see in the case of China, I think it's interesting to see that they have, in the case of India, not China, we see here that the approach has been on the one side trying to offer the combination of high-tech, low-tech, and no-tech materials. So emphasizing the importance of multi-channel strategy, but at the same time, securing that the education community will have access to one of the largest repositories of educational contents that today exist, which is called Diksha. with a huge volume of materials, but also enabling the possibility of creating contents and updating these contents, which happens to be an incremental opportunity for engaging more people and to having highly contextualized, relevant learning materials that can be of help for the students. Now, we observe here that they have deployed strategies to secure that the parental engagement to the learning activities of the students is going to be helpful on the one side, and on the other side, integrating and promoting the use of some apps that will facilitate and provide the appropriate support for teachers while they are on the task, to receive guidance, to provide support, to share their experiences, which happen to be one of the most fundamental aspects if we want to secure high engagement from the teacher community, and also to provide distributed ways of support between teachers. In the case of Chile, for instance, they offer a very broad approach of solutions, some of them relying on the remote access to digital learning materials, when in other cases, delivery of education content through television or radio, with other kind of incentives and supports from the public administration in order to reduce the digital divide, so providing access to learners who might be living in environments with no connectivity or which are remotely very far away from urban areas. They build up a partnership with Google, and what you see here is a very diverse set of options. And here the key question is, to what extent the learners and the teachers receive the guidance to navigate through all these options? Because it's very easy to put the focus on the input, and at the same time, it's not surprised to see that students might get lost among these options when there's no clarity on the guidance. I'm not saying that this is the case of Chile, but I'm offering just as an example where you have a broad toolkit of opportunities. Also, they will be important to offer a clear guidance. So in the case of Canada, for instance, they have decided to provide some new regulations to secure the quality of their blended learning experience, to offer some clear standards of what are going to be the protocols, the skills needed, the amount of time dedicated, and the minimum quality standard that need to be adopted in these environments of permanent transition. In other countries, we have observed where there might be perhaps a less digital-oriented remote learning strategy, and it's quite interesting to observe that in the case of Japan, for instance, they have also relied on the use of non-digital materials to facilitate the learning experience. I'm not saying that internet is not relevant there, but I'm saying that through the education system, the use of paper-based material has been essential. The case of Finland, for instance, it's interesting to see that they have a long tradition of highly qualified teachers to a very high stakes standard to access to the education system, and that has been one of the key pillars to facilitate the remote and blended learning experience throughout the different months. But in addition to having the needed technology to make the learning happen, I think it's interesting that the current discussion today, just like the case of Estonia, is everybody needs to get back to the in-person, and we have to reduce the amount of time that students are having on remote learning. So heavy trust on the in-person, face-to-face contact, despite that they might have, just as I said, Finland and Estonia cases where the access to technology is not a problem. Now, what we observe in these experiences is a combination of options. And I think here it's important to understand that these combinations will rely on the amount of face-to-face, but also the kind of how decentralized is the learning experience. In the case of Shanghai in China, we will observe that they have a very interesting practice where they have been transitioning from the 40 minutes face-to-face lesson to 20 plus 20, where 20 minutes of the online lesson is not face-to-face, it's online. They have a remote, what they call remote big lesson, where they have a national champion teacher who will give a master class But at the same time, students and the local teacher will be following that master class. And after those 20 minutes, there will be the opportunity for the local teacher to do what they call a small lesson, where this teacher will connect this masterclass with what is happening at the local context, with some of the contents and discussions that they have had in the past, with some of the realities of the cultural reality of the context, and that also bring the possibility of having a much higher level of interaction with the small class in this local teacher. So this combination of remote but also local offer opportunities for having much more flexible approaches, where the emphasis has been on the quality, but also securing that there's high level of interaction with the student. Now, I think one interesting case that we have observed in the last couple of months is what we saw in the UK, where the government decided to invest heavily on the importance of having remote tutoring, especially for those students who might be left behind, for those students who might be struggling, for those students who might be under more vulnerable situations. So they decided to create a national fund that dedicate £1 billion just for what they call the tutoring revolution. And these tutors will be offering a number of dedicated hours to boost the attention, the support, and the guidance that the students might need. And I think that's an interesting strategy, because this is not a specific kind of technology, but it's diversifying the forms of learning, where the traditional classroom, rather in person or remotely, also have an additional extension of learning opportunities that will be happening through this tutoring system. And I guess, for instance, it's important to mention that in the case of India, we have observed an explosion of different forms of tutoring, one-to-many, many-to-many, or inclusive, when there are some students who can provide some peer tutoring, what they call near peer tutoring, which I think is an interesting approach to take into account. And that model has been also enriched by providing grant to connectivity and devices for those students who might be in most need. Now, what we have observed in all these options, and many others that we have collected in previous studies, is we could have more digital or less digital solutions with higher or lower level of in-person learning. But what happens to be essential is the regular interaction, quality interaction between the teacher and the student, which can be in person or remotely, but it has to be systematic. I strongly encourage that parents can be part of that interaction, and at the same time, it's strongly encouraged that whatever technological solution is taken, there will be a well-planned pedagogical structure to provide guidance to the learners, regardless of the technology they will be using. It can be in low resource settings, where the main technology can be access to printed materials, radio. That happens to be much more rich when you can combine that at least with an SMS or any messaging service. But also, in the other side of the spectrum, we will observe where there's access to technology, the teachers can be enhanced by the integration of some adaptive systems, where the interaction is not only with the tutor, but also can be with a system that provide some level of personalization according to the learner's need. So let me conclude mentioning that there's some key lessons here that I think are important. The first one has to do with the learning is really a social experience. So we have to design strategies for the students to know where and how to reach for help when they need, at home, in the classroom, but also at the system level. Second, in many of these cases, there has been a process of prioritization of some of the key subjects that needs to be taught, and in that sense, that says a lot about the amount of content that you can teach remotely or blended. So it's challenging to think that you will be able to teach the same amount of contents when you combine these different modalities. And at the same time, technology, when well integrated, it can be a real help to support the role of the teacher. So the adaptive learning system that I already mentioned is a clear example of how that can help to customize some of the learning experience when teachers need to work putting their attention to 20 or 30 students at the same time. Now, in that sense, it's going to be critical to address the digital gaps that still remain in many places in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of the capacities that the students need to make the best of this technology, and at the same time, the capacities that teachers and administrators will require to make the technology a tool and not a barrier. Now, multi-channel strategies happens to be an inclusive way to offer diversification. Different technologies will offer different learning experiences, but also at the same time, we have to define what and when and what kind of technology should be adapted. And at the same time, it's good idea to design different monitoring strategies to see the progress, the engagement, the participation, whether we have to dropout, whether we have to take supportive actions to provide, for instance, tutoring or any kind of assistance that might be needed. I think if we try to see on the half full of this very difficult pandemic, these transformations can really lead into long-term transformations in terms of redefining what means to be learning, but where the learning can take place and what can be the role in environments where the knowledge has been diversified. And at the same time, why not? And I think it's important to conclude with this idea, parents and the family can play an important role, and they happens to be a key factor to make the remote and the blended learning experience important and provide the systematic assistance and help to students who might be either struggling or might need special guidance to learn how to learn and how to administrate the learning. So I hope this global overview, very quick but comprehensive, I hope will be of help for the discussions that you will be having. Thank you.